In the closing months of World War II, Europe was drowning in smoke, rubble, and blood. The German Reich, once celebrated by its leaders as destined to last 1,000 years, was now collapsing before the eyes of the world. From the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Warsaw, the Allies had pushed relentlessly, clawing back every inch of land that Adolf Hitler's armies had seized in their lightning-fast campaigns of conquest. Yet even as defeat loomed, the Nazi regime refused to surrender. They clung to their vision of dominance with a mixture of fanaticism, delusion, and fear, dragging millions of soldiers and civilians into the abyss with them.
Welcome to Matter of Time, your destination for real, unique, and eye-opening stories. From hidden truths to fascinating events, we bring you content that informs, inspires, and keeps you hooked. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because every story is better when we experience it together.
The story of Nazi Germany's last defeat is not merely the account of a military collapse. It is the story of desperation, of battles waged in shattered cities, of generals struggling to obey impossible orders, and of a dictator isolated in a bunker beneath Berlin, clinging to illusions of victory as the walls closed in. To understand the end, we must picture Europe in 1945. Germany was surrounded. From the west, the American, British, Canadian, and French armies were rolling across the Rhine, bringing with them overwhelming firepower and resources. From the east, the Soviet Union had unleashed a colossal storm of men and machines, tearing through the remnants of the Wehrmacht as they surged toward Berlin. The once proud German war machine was a shadow of itself, reduced to broken divisions, poorly equipped Volkssturm militia, and teenage boys pulled from schools to hold rifles against seasoned armies. Still, the Nazi leadership preached defiance. Goebbels declared that Germany would fight until its last breath, painting pictures of miraculous wonder weapons that would reverse the tide of war. Hitler ordered his generals to hold cities at all costs, regardless of the hopeless odds. To disobey meant execution. To retreat was treason. For the ordinary German soldier, this final chapter was not about conquest, but about survival. They fought not to build an empire, but to stave off the inevitable, to delay the advancing Allies long enough for their families to flee westward, away from the vengeful Red Army. And in those bitter months, Europe descended into a brutal struggle, where every street, every forest, and every river crossing became a battlefield. The last defeat of Nazi Germany was not a single battle, but a series of crushing blows that came one after another, leaving the Reich bleeding, broken, and finally extinguished. This is the story of how it happened. The Western Front and the crumbling Reich. By the start of 1945, the Western Allies had achieved what many once thought impossible. After breaking through the heavily defended Normandy beaches and pushing across France in the summer of 1944, they had crossed into Germany itself. The mighty Rhine River, long considered the natural barrier protecting the German heartland, was no longer secure. American forces surged across it, building pontoon bridges under fire, while British and Canadian troops advanced through the north. For civilians, this was the nightmare that Nazi propaganda had promised would never happen. Allied bombers roared overhead day and night, reducing cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden to ash. The thunder of artillery became constant. Ordinary families who had once cheered Hitler's victories now dug through the rubble of their homes, struggling to survive in a nation on the verge of collapse. And yet, Hitler's orders grew irrational. He commanded that no ground be surrendered voluntarily, that every city must become a fortress. German generals, many of whom knew the war was lost, faced a terrible choice: obey the Führer and waste countless lives, or disobey and risk execution for treason. Few dared to defy him openly. Meanwhile, American and British units pressed forward with overwhelming resources. The Allies possessed air supremacy, vast supplies of fuel, and endless streams of tanks and trucks. German divisions, in contrast, were hollow shells. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, food, or even ammunition. Some units were composed of boys as young as 16 and men over 60, armed with outdated rifles and Panzerfaust rockets, told to hold the line against Sherman tanks. In March 1945, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, crossing the Rhine on a massive scale. Paratroopers descended from the skies while artillery pounded German positions. Within days, Allied forces were pouring into the industrial Ruhr Valley, the beating heart of German production. Here, more than 300,000 German soldiers were surrounded and captured in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. It was one of the most devastating losses for the Wehrmacht, shattering its ability to defend Western Germany. Still, Hitler refused to accept reality. In speeches delivered from his underground bunker in Berlin, he raged that the Allies would soon turn against one another, that America and Britain would clash with the Soviets, giving Germany a gun. To the very end, he believed in a miracle that would never come. As American and British troops drove deeper into Germany, they uncovered horrors that stunned even hardened veterans. In repatriation, concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, soldiers found emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, and evidence of crimes beyond imagination. The myth of Germany's fight for survival was shattered. The world saw clearly what the Nazis had built in their pursuit of dominance. For the ordinary German people, the Western advance meant both relief and fear. Relief because surrendering to the Americans or British often promised a chance at survival. Fear because many knew what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands in the East. Families fled in massive columns, desperately moving westward, hoping to find safety before the Red Army arrived. And in those bitter months, Europe descended into a brutal struggle where every street, every forest, and every river crossing became a battlefield.
The Eastern Front and Soviet advance toward Berlin. While the Western Allies carved through Germany with overwhelming force, it was in the East that the war reached its most brutal and decisive climax. The Soviet Union, having endured 4 years of unimaginable suffering, was now determined to crush the Nazi regime once and for all. Entire cities had been burned, tens of millions of Soviet citizens had been killed or displaced, and the Red Army marched westward with vengeance in its heart. By January 1945, the Soviets had launched the massive Vistula Oder offensive. Within weeks, their armies advanced over 300 miles, sweeping across Poland and smashing through German defenses with terrifying speed. Cities fell one after another: Warsaw, Krakow, and eventually Breslau, all while Soviet tanks pressed relentlessly toward the German capital. For the German soldiers defending the Eastern Front, the experience was apocalyptic. Unlike the Americans and British, the Soviets gave no quarter. Every village, every farm, every stretch of forest became a death trap. Entire divisions were annihilated in encirclements, their survivors sent eastward into captivity, often never to return. The once wanted Wehrmacht, which had stormed into Russia in 1941, was now reduced to shattered remnants, desperately trying to hold back an unstoppable tide. Civilians bore the heaviest burden. As Soviet forces advanced, millions of Germans fled west in one of the largest mass migrations in European history. Long columns of refugees trudged through the snow, pulling carts piled with their few belongings, hoping to reach safety before the Red Army overtook them. Many never made it. The harsh winter, relentless bombing, and waves of chaos left countless dead along the roadsides. Inside Berlin, the atmosphere grew increasingly grim. The capital was a city of ruins. Allied bombings had already reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, and food supplies were dwindling. Hitler, however, remained detached from reality. Hidden in his underground Führer bunker, he ranted about phantom armies that existed only on maps, ordering counterattacks from divisions that had long since ceased to exist. He believed that if Berlin could hold out long enough, political divisions between the Soviets and the Western Allies would erupt, and Germany might yet survive. By April 1945, the Soviets launched the final assault, the Battle of Berlin. Nearly 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, encircled the city. Against them stood fewer than 100,000 German defenders, a desperate mix of exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers, SS fanatics, Volkssturm militia, and even children drafted into the Hitler Youth. Armed with Panzerfausts, Molotov cocktails, and little else, they were ordered to fight to the last man. The battle quickly descended into chaos. Street by street, building by building, Berlin was consumed by fire and destruction. Soviet artillery flattened entire blocks before infantry advanced. Tanks rumbled through the avenues, crushing barricades beneath their treads. Civilians huddled in basements as the earth shook around them, listening to the screams and the endless thunder of guns. For the Germans, surrender was not always an option. SS officers often executed soldiers who attempted to give up. The city became a nightmare where fanaticism, despair, and survival collided. Yet despite the hopelessness of the fight, many defenders resisted fiercely, unwilling to face what awaited them if they were captured by the Soviets. By the end of April, Soviet forces had closed in on the city center. The Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi power, became a fortress where hundreds died in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Above the ruins, Soviet soldiers raised their red flag, a sign to the world that the Nazi Empire was finished. But deep beneath the city, Adolf Hitler remained in denial, preparing to meet his end as the last battles raged above him.
Hitler's final days in the bunker and his death. In the final days of April 1945, Berlin was no longer a city, but a smoldering graveyard. Entire districts lay in ruins, the air filled with dust and smoke, the ground trembling constantly from artillery barrages. Amid this apocalypse, the Nazi regime clung to life in the dark corridors of the Führer bunker, buried deep beneath the shattered Reich chancellery. Inside, Adolf Hitler presided over a fantasy world that had long ceased to exist. He shuffled through maps, shifting non-existent divisions into place, barking orders at generals who knew they were meaningless. Reports of Soviet advances poured in by the hour, yet Hitler raged that his armies would regroup, that Steiner's counterattack would save the city, that victory was still possible if only his officers showed the same willpower he demanded. But General Steiner's divisions were broken. No reinforcements were coming. Everyone in the bunker knew the truth. Berlin was lost, and with it, the Reich. The mood among Hitler's inner circle shifted from dread to fatalism. Joseph Goebbels, the fanatical propaganda minister, remained by his side, vowing never to leave the capital. Heinrich Himmler, once one of Hitler's most loyal followers, had secretly attempted to negotiate peace with the Allies, a betrayal that enraged the Führer. Hermann Göring, too, was dismissed in disgrace after suggesting that he take command. Hitler felt abandoned, betrayed by those he once trusted, surrounded only by a dwindling handful of die-hard loyalists. Outside, the Soviet advance pressed closer. On April 25th, Berlin was fully encircled.
Soviet artillery pounded the government district, reducing it to rubble. The bunker shook with every impact. In those final days, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief ceremony within the bunker. Guests offered half-hearted congratulations in the flickering candlelight, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the earth above. The newlyweds shared a final meal. Hitler appeared frail, his hands trembling, his body wasted by illness and stress. Gone was the fiery dictator who once commanded millions. In his place was a broken man awaiting the inevitable. On April 30th, 1945, the end came. After saying goodbye to his staff, Hitler retreated with Eva Braun to his private quarters. Moments later, a single gunshot rang out. When aides entered, they found Hitler slumped lifeless on a sofa, a pistol still in his hand. Eva Braun had taken cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden, doused in gasoline, and set alight amid the ruins. The dictator who had plunged the world into chaos had chosen to escape judgment by his own hand. In the bunker, silence followed. Those who remained were left with no illusions. The Führer was dead. The empire he had promised to last 1,000 years had survived barely 12. Above ground, the battle raged on. Soviet forces pressed into the city center, storming the ruins of the Reichstag, raising their flag in triumph. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, had fallen. Yet even as news of Hitler's death spread, the war did not immediately end. Across Germany, pockets of resistance still fought, clinging to hopeless orders. Some refused to believe the Führer was truly gone. Others feared what surrender would bring. For many, the nightmare was not yet over. In the days following Hitler's death, what remained of the Nazi leadership attempted to negotiate surrender. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, named as Hitler's successor, hoped to save as many Germans as possible by surrendering to the Western Allies while continuing to resist the Soviets. But the Allies demanded unconditional surrender, nothing less. On May 7, 1945, in Reims, France, Germany finally signed the Act of Capitulation. The next day, in Berlin, a second signing confirmed it before the Soviets. The war in Europe was over. Across the world, crowds filled the streets in celebration. In London, Paris, Moscow, and New York, people embraced and cheered, rejoicing that the long nightmare had ended. For Germany, however, the end was one of devastation. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead or displaced, and the horrors of the Nazi regime stood revealed to the world. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had ended not with triumph, but with ashes, shame, and defeat. The last defeat of Nazi Germany was not just the fall of an army or a government. It was the collapse of an ideology built on hatred, violence, and conquest. And though the war had ended, the scars it left behind would shape Europe and the world for generations to come.